Revolutionary greetings, comrades. In our political education today, we want to focus on the liberation movement, talking about the African National Congress. And we want to argue that in the African National Congress, including SWAPO of Namibia, is a good story to tell. Why are we saying the African National Congress is a good story to tell? Most liberation movements in Africa, particularly in our region, went through challenges in the first 20 years of their independence or freedom. You will know that UNIP, when Zambia gained its independence under the leadership of the former liberation movement UNIP, it housed liberation movements from across the continent, mainly in Southern Africa. His Excellency President Kaunda was in charge for 27 years. Zambia went through serious crisis to an extent that by 1991, the majority of Zambians were fed up with UNIP. In 1989-99, the workers in Zambia mobilized themselves under the leadership of their federation, the trade union, and established a political formation which went on to defeat UNIP in the 1991 elections, with Frederick Chuluba becoming president, who was former Secretary General of the trade union in Zambia. I had privilege to visit Zambia in 1991. There was indeed an economic crisis. I remember I crossed to Livingstone in 1991. I was carrying 200 Zim dollars at the time. When I changed it to kwacha, I needed a plastic bag to carry the money. That's how the crisis was in Zambia at the time. We know that 20 years after independence in Zimbabwe, ZANU-PF was no longer popular with the working class. You know that in the first decade of independence, it committed a genocide against the people of Matabeleland and parts of Midlands. While it tried in some provinces to build infrastructure, schools, clinics, and roads, but the genocide in Matabeleland and parts of Midlands painted a bad picture in terms of ZANU-PF role. It adopted neoliberal policies in 1991, 11 years after our independence. The Trade Union Federation in Zimbabwe, ZCTU, pulled out of an alliance with the ZANU-PF, which was established in 1991. By 2000, as I'm saying, it was no longer popular with the working class in Zimbabwe. The liberation movement in Tanzania, which is now Chama Cha Mapinduzi, also after 20 years of independence, it went through a crisis. Tanzania went through a crisis, economic crisis. We have discussed Ujama, the socialist concept as adopted by the ruling party in Tanzania, headed by the late Julius Nyerere. The ruling party had to reform itself because it was no longer popular with the working class, with the peasants, because Ujama failed to meet its targets. It had to undergo a renewal. And a part of the renewal that has sustained the liberation movement in Tanzania was first and foremost to renew the leadership of the movement. Every 10 years, Chama Cha Mapinduzi will elect a new leadership. And this has helped it to maintain power in Tanzania, to continue to renew itself, something which SWAPO and the African National Congress are doing. In Angola, the liberation movement went into a serious crisis, backing a war, a civil war, sponsored by the Americans and the apartheid South Africa. When it gained independence from Portugal in 1975, it had to face UNITA. Many Angolians died in the war. And of course, after the war, there were allegations of corruption. And there was some form of what others described as some kind of cultism in the leadership of the liberation movement. It did not have a clear succession plan until 2017 that the current president took power. We has recently won elections, and we did a video focusing on the elections in Angola. Frelimo faced similar circumstances in Mozambique when it gained independence under the leadership of the late President Zamora Machel. It had to battle the Renewal, sponsored by apartheid South Africa and Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia as well. Until I think 1992, when a peace agreement was signed. Frelimo now also undergoes a renewal. It now changes its leadership after every 10 years. The renewal of the leadership has meant that the party renews itself corrects, and it has been able to mobilize society and maintain its hold on power, turning Renamo a chance to win political power in Mozambique. So in the main, liberation movements or former liberation movements have held challenges with secession. In the case of ZANU-PF, we needed the military to resolve the secession question inside the ZANU-PF. Mugabe had been appointed or elected as the head of ZANU in 1974, 1975, when he came out of prison. He had built some kind of dynasty, and the politics of cultism was rooted in ZANU-PF under his leadership. Every time the question of secession was raised, Mugabe and his loyalists will deal with those that questioned his leadership or wanted a clear secession plan inside the ZANU-PF. To an extent that the military had to intervene in 2017. And we are seeing the same pattern under the leadership of President Emmerson Mnangagwa. There is no clear secession plan, and the cultism is taking its roots again in ZANU-PF under the leadership of Emmerson Mnangagwa. Because it is being said that there is no one, as it was said under the leadership of Mugabe, that there is no one who can lead. It has elevated an individual to be more powerful than the institution itself. And because of that, it's backing corruption, or the liberation movements in the main have failed to deal with the corruption. But of course, The issue of term limits, and I want to submit, an issue of term limits is not the yardstick to measure the success of a party in power in terms of governance. Because if I were to say a party, because it does not address the succession question, or it does not change its leadership, maybe after a decade, therefore it will not perform, might not be scientific accurate. But you are seeing in some countries, in some inside former liberation movements, that change leadership, that there is some kind of changes also inside the liberation movement and the country. This is something that we need to study and research. I'm saying this because if you look into Cuba and Libya, Comrade Fidel Castro was the leader of the Cuban Revolution for years. And his leadership was guided by the principles of the revolution. President Fidel Castro and the rest of the leadership of Cuba were popular with the masses of Cuba. Same with the brother leader, Muammar Gaddafi. After the Libyan revolution, he spent years at the head of the government in Libya. And Libya, or Libyans, benefited a lot. There were a lot of massive improvements in the lives of the people of Libya under the leadership of brother leader Gaddafi. So it might not be accurate. I know that I'm contradicting myself now, but that's the purpose of a discussion. That on one hand, we have former liberation movements that are changing leaders after every 10 years. And it has helped them to renew themselves, to remain in power. At the same time, we have others, like I've cited, Cuba and Libya, that were popular with the mass of the people without the question of a term limit being assigned or being adopted to say that you need to spend 10 years at the head of state, thereafter you resign. It doesn't matter how good you are. So one then might argue and submit that some comrades that led the revolution or the struggle against colonialism, as we have said previously, did not transform, or liberation movements did not transform our economies. Our economies remain in the hands of our colonialists. So in the former liberation movements, one must create a relationship with the capital. You stay for 10 years, you have to go, a new person comes in who has a good relationship with capital. And as we have argued in our previous videos, that a capitalist understands that in order to maximize profit, a worker must be educated. You need to create schools so that a worker or the future workers, so to speak, will go to school and understand or be able to carry out instructions at the workplace, and they use machinery, the tools of production at the workplace. They should be able to communicate. So in a capitalist society, education becomes key. Secondly, capitalists will understand that when a worker is injured at the workplace, the worker must receive medical assistance so that they are treated quickly, they go back to the chain, to the line of production to continue working. They provide infrastructure, as we have discussed, particularly in the Southern Africa, that our colonialists understood or wanted to make this part of Africa as their own home. So they would build infrastructure and provide transport so that workers arrive at work in time. So you will then find that inside the liberation movement, a leader will have, when they reach their 10th year, they are no longer popular with capital, a new person comes in. And when we analyze, we see this renewal, as I'm talking about a renewal. So the African National Congress has gone through that phase. While it faces challenges in major cities, but it is still popular with the working class. 27 years after democratic breakthrough, or what it calls freedom, 27 years after freedom. From 1994 to 2018, it built 3.2 million RDP houses, a massive achievement for a former liberation movement. Most liberation movements did not achieve this. It had electrified 7.4 million households from 1994 to 2018. Millions of South Africans have access to clean, safe drinking water, thanks to the leadership of the African National Congress. The economy remains stable, though it faces challenges. And of course, it continues to renew its leadership. But of course, there are accusations that some are closer to capital. There's always this inside the liberation movement, the relationship with the Stellenbosch, as we see it being said by other factions within the African National Congress. But we must say that the African National Congress, and indeed SWAPO, which we'll analyze in the next video, have achieved far more than what other former liberation movements have achieved. I'm not a fan of the South African Constitution because in my view, it's a liberal constitution. I'm not a fan. I'm not sure our comrades in the South African Communist Party, but personally, I'm not a fan of the South African Constitution. But what it has achieved, the ANC, is that it has allowed opposition parties to have a voice. We hardly hear of opposition leaders been arrested for opposing the ANC. We hardly hear of any opposition leaders visited in the middle of the night by intelligence or security forces simply for criticizing the leadership of the African National Congress. And in most African countries, we know that the issue of Phala will not be discussed, because those that will be discussing Phala will be imprisoned. So in terms of building a democratic state compared to other former liberation movements, the African National Congress has done well. In some countries like Zimbabwe, trade unions will not take to the streets to demonstrate. In South Africa, trade unions do demonstrate, do picket without them being beaten up by the police. Yes, of course, there is Marikana, which is still being investigated or being discussed on what really happened. But outside Marikana, workers on daily basis, they march, they picket, without the leadership of the workers being thrown into prison, as we have seen, particularly in Zimbabwe. So this is why we're saying the African National Congress has a good story to tell. I know that some friends of mine who follow this YouTube channel would want the ANC out in 2024. But we remain inspired by the leadership of the African National Congress. Yes, we disagree with it on a number of issues. But when you compare with other former liberation movements, the ANC and the SWAPO have done well in their own countries. Please share your views in the comment section. You might be a member of the African National Congress or a communist in the SACP, want to hear your views, or a member of the trade union movement, want to hear your views 27 years after the democratic breakthrough. What do you think? And of course, you might be opposed to the ANC. Share with us your comments. Please circulate this video, and please do subscribe to this YouTube channel. Otherwise, Amandla Comrades.